Hi class, today we are going to go over Aquinas' 5 ways. This will be a somewhat involved lecture, so really pay attention when I say what you will need to know for the final and what you won't. On the plus side, the final shifting to online format with open notes should hopefully make that a little easier. So, Aquinas was a medieval theologian. Reminder, he was working from a really big work called the Summa Theologia, that was intended to be written for other Catholic monks. So these are not meant as conversion pieces. Having said that, the Aquinas is a great teaching tool for 2 reasons. One, they're relatively straightforward arguments, and as such, they're really good, just crisp, clear examples of what a cosmological argument is trying to do. And then second, though, they're not persuasive. And we know they're not persuasive. And whether you're a theist or an atheist, you should not find them persuasive. Having said that, we realize that what needs to be added to them ultimately tells us something very important. Their shortcomings are really going to draw out what a successful cosmological argument has to do. Just for kicks, they're on my shelf. If you see that set of 5 volumes together, that's the Summa Theologia, or at least the part that was written before he died. So when I say the 5 ways should not be overemphasized as somehow definitive, they're 1 page out of that. But they're really an important page. So we're going to talk about the 5 ways. Let's pause here. This is also going to be a really, really good practice in terms of trying to pull arguments out of the text. Remember, we were working on that quite a bit in the apology. So I would actually encourage you right now, pause this video, and just go see if you could construct the first and second ways as arguments with premises and a conclusion. Just like we did on the board in Unit 1. I say the first and second way because the arguments are exactly parallel. So anyway, go. Hopefully you took my advice seriously there, but if you're back, let's talk about the first 2 of the 5 ways. Now, sorry, trying to get you out of the sun. First of all, remember, big picture, what are cosmological arguments trying to do? Start from some very general metaphysical or pre-scientific fact about the world and show that that deductively implies some sort of first being. So I would actually start a column in your notes of things that all cosmological arguments do. They're deductive, they're a posteriori, they argue that some very general or pre-scientific or metaphysical fact about the world implies a first being. Notice that since it only implies a first being, we could add a 4th thing there, that even if they succeed, you need a lot more argument to get to a god of theism. For instance, first mover sure as heck doesn't say anything about morality, does it? And leave room for a 5th thing, as we're going to see, and that's what's going to be a little tricky about today's lecture. So, let's turn to the first way. What's the very, very general fact about the world it starts with? The title gives it away, from motion. So, premise 1, there is motion. Stuff moves. Now, we're going to try to get from that premise to the conclusion, there is a first unmoved mover. We need 2 more premises to do that. Hopefully you found them. Premise 2, something can't be both mover and moved in one and the same motion. So you could put the one in the same motion in parentheses, but because trivially, well, of course, sometimes I'm the mover, and sometimes I'm the thing that is moved. That's not what he's talking about. We're talking about, the microscopic smallest motion, whatever that smallest motion is, something is not both the mover and the moved. Put another way, if that was false, there would be free infinite energy for everyone. So something can't be both mover and moved. That's premise 2. But notice, that doesn't get us to the conclusion that there's a first mover. There's a premise missing. Why? Because as stated, well, stuff moves. That means something must have moved it. That doesn't imply a first mover because theoretically we could have a chain of motion going back for infinity. And so you will notice we need that all-important third premise to make the argument valid, that an infinite regress is impossible. Premise 3. What's an infinite regress? What it sounds like, going back forever. So Aquinas says those are impossible, therefore getting at his conclusion. So the argument, 3 premises in the conclusion. Premise, there is motion. Premise, something can't be both mover and moved in one and the same motion. Premise, an infinite regress is impossible. Conclusion, there is a first unmoved mover. So, we are going to talk much more about the premises 2 and 3 in a moment, but before we do that, remember I told you the second way is perfectly parallel. So the second way is from efficient causation. Efficient causation is just the notion of causation, of cause and effect that you're used to. So the normal notion of cause and effect. We will talk more about other notions in a bit. So there is efficient causation. But wait a minute, something cannot be both cause and effect in one and the same event. An infinite regress is impossible, thus validly arriving at the conclusion, there must be a first uncaused cause. Those are the first and second way. So let's go back to our argument evaluation from Unit 1. First of all, we've already said, or I've already said, the argument's valid. Yes, the guy they named the word scholar after gave us valid arguments. No surprise there. But why? Because if it were true that motion is like that, and it were true that an infinite regress was impossible, it would follow that there must be a first unmoved mover. So, of course, it's valid. Is it sound? Well, what premises do the sciences give us? Premise 1 seems to be true. There is motion. Premises 2 and 3 are actually philosophical premises. And this is where things are going to get a little complicated. We have to invoke a principle of metaphysics called the principle of sufficient reason. So the principle of sufficient reason, you're going to be writing it a lot. You could abbreviate PSR for short. Let's situate it. First of all, roughly speaking, it's just the claim that things have explanations. Very roughly speaking. But every cosmological argument invokes the principle of sufficient reason in some way. So that fifth blank and the things that all cosmological arguments have in common, you could fill in with argues using the principle of sufficient reason. So we use the principle of sufficient reason to go from the general fact about the world to a first being. Second of all, notice I called it a metaphysical principle because we're not talking about knowledge. We're talking about the way the world is. So the principle of sufficient reason tells us we know things have explanations. That's a very different claim than knowing what those explanations are. So all the principle of sufficient reason says it's a claim about the world. The world is such that things have explanations. Things happen for a reason. There's not randomness in the true sense of randomness. So that's what the principle of sufficient reason is. Just this very general claim that stuff has explanation. Now, as stated, you might say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't say anything about infinite regresses. And that's why things get tricky. Because there's 2 versions of the principle of sufficient reason. On the review sheet, I believe I called them strong and weak. And they're really about what we mean by explanation. So the weak principle of sufficient reason is just that. Well, everything that happens has an explanation. Roughly speaking, this is the claim you don't have to worry about a tiger appearing over your head for no reason. That's what's called the weak version of the principle of sufficient reason, weak PSR. And notice, weak PSR is actually used for premise 2. The claim that something can't be both cause and effect in the second version, second way, or the claim that something that can't be both mover and moved Those are just ways of saying tigers don't just appear. Motion doesn't just appear. Effects don't just appear. And so premise 2 uses weak PSR. Now, what is the relationship between weak PSR and infinite regresses? Good question. Roughly speaking, weak PSR is consistent with infinite regresses. So imagine, if you will, an infinitely long line of dominoes that are falling. Does that violate weak PSR? Well, weak PSR just says everything has an explanation. So all we have to ask is there an explanation for why each domino fell? Yes. Take that domino, ask why did it fall? The explanation will be it was struck by the domino before it. So infinite regresses and weak PSR, perfectly compatible. So now let's talk about strong PSR. Strong PSR entails everything weak PSR does, but also forbids infinite regresses. So let's talk about why. So strong PSR is instead the claim that everything has a total explanation, or everything can be completely explained. So that's the different word, that total or complete. That's the only difference. But notice that has an interesting effect. We can, in principle, never have a total or complete explanation for an infinitely long string of falling dominoes. Why did that domino fall? Because it was struck by that one, which was struck by that one, which was struck by that one, which was struck by that one, and you will never finish explaining. So if we make the stronger position and say the world is such that everything has a total or complete explanation, that means we're endorsing strong PSR, and that also entails that there can't be infinite regresses. And so notice Aquinas' first and second way both rely on strong PSR. So because premise 3 has to be there, no infinite regresses or the arguments are not valid. All right, so that's PSR. That's tricky. Feel free to ask questions about that in the discussion, but the highlights. First of all, it's a claim about the way the world is. Never forget that. Big picture, both versions of PSR basically say the world is such that everything has an explanation, that nothing unexplainable in principle happens. But we could read that two different ways. Does every event have an explanation? Weak PSR. Or does every event have a total and complete explanation? Strong PSR. So, now that we have that background, we can finish evaluating the arguments. Oh yeah, we were evaluating arguments. So, is the first way sound? Well, we know premise 1 is true. Is premise 2 true? Well, if you accept that tigers don't just appear, you say, yeah, premise 2 is true. Or I have better reason to believe premise 2 is true than false. However, we then need to shift to premise 3. Premise 3, remember, is the strong PSR claim, the claim that an infinite regress is impossible. So here's a philosophical premise, and now we have to ask, do I have better reason to think infinite regresses are possible, or better reason to think infinite regresses are impossible? And however you feel about that is how you will evaluate the first two ways. If you think infinite regresses are impossible, you're going to call the argument sound. If you think the infinite regresses are are possible, you're going to call them unsound. So here's a question. Do you think infinite regresses are possible or not? If you ask me, I don't know. I have a PhD with a concentration in metaphysics, but that doesn't really help much. It's just an intuition one way or the other. So notice we're starting to see why the first and second way are not terribly persuasive. You have to accept that an infinite regress is impossible in order for you to call that argument sound and therefore persuasive. So, another good column to start in your notes, well, what would a contemporary cosmological argument take in order to be taken seriously? It has to use only weak PSR. because if your cosmological argument invokes strong PSR, then you have to be preaching to the metaphysical choir, so to speak. Aquinas' argument is only going to be considered sound by those who believe infinite regresses are impossible, which are probably already theists. And so it's actually undesirable to have a cosmological argument that invokes strong PSR, because most people just don't have that strong metaphysical intuition about it. Which means, notice, we might be committing one of the mistakes identified in the Euthyphro. We might be taking something complex and hard, whether there's a higher power or not, and trying to resolve it by introducing an even more slippery notion, strong PSR. So that's one reason these two arguments aren't generally considered persuasive. A second reason, and this is important, let's say that we grant that they're sound. Does that actually help? In this strange instance, no. Because the conclusions are so vague that an atheist naturalist can accept them. So an atheist naturalist can say, well, of course there is an unmoved mover. I call it the Big Bang, or the Big Bang singularity. Second way, well, of course there's an uncaused cause. I call it the Big Bang. And so here's the even deeper problem with those two arguments, is that their conclusions are so general that even atheist naturalists can accept them. Now, why is that a problem? Take an analogy. Let's say you're trying to decide between two cars. And one thing you'll notice is that both cars get the exact same gas mileage. What does that tell you? Gas mileage doesn't help you make that decision. Now go back to the first and second way. Well, the conclusion is accepted by both theists and atheist naturalists alike, which means those arguments don't help us choose between the two. So a contemporary persuasive cosmological argument needs to avoid strong PSR, relying on only weak, and it needs to be valid, of course, otherwise you have no reason to accept the conclusion. But it also needs a conclusion that is incompatible with atheist naturalism. So that's the three things a cosmological argument needs to do in order to be taken seriously, so to speak, and be a respectable argument. We will look at an argument that does those things in terms of Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. So let's pause here and introduce that. So first of all, the assignment is to look it up online. So go Google William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, K-A-L-A-M. First of all, why are we Googling it? Because this is an argument that people still defend, which means the copyright holders are still alive, which means it's not in the textbook. But the fact that people still defend it means it must be valid, it must use only weak PSR, and it must have a conclusion incompatible with atheist naturalism. So, for the next reading, find the Kalam cosmological argument, not hard to find, and think in terms of how does it meet those three criteria. Why is it valid? Why is its conclusion incompatible with atheist naturalism? That's a little tricky, by the way. And why does it use only weak PSR? So by looking at Aquinas' first two ways, we've learned what a good cosmological argument needs to look like. We still have to talk about the third, the fourth, and the fifth way. So let me very briefly mention these and remind you of what you will be required to know for these three. So, first of all, the third way, remember, Aquinas was a really smart guy. They named the word scholar after him. He was well aware that not everybody accepted strong PSR, not everybody had strong intuitions about infinite regresses. And so first and foremost, what you should know about the third way, it allows infinite regresses. So Aquinas' starting point is, assuming we could have an infinite temporal regress, that is, assume time could keep going backwards forever. So, here's the rough idea of the argument. I will not ask you to reconstruct this argument on the exam. The general idea is, if we had an infinite temporal regress, the following would happen. First of all, there are contingent beings. What is a contingent being? A being that it's possible that it exists, possible that it doesn't exist. That's supposed to be a basic fact about the world. Well, everything in this room is contingent, including myself, except maybe the smallest particles. Certainly there was a time I didn't exist, and there'll be a time I don't exist. So of course I'm contingent, as is my coffee cup, as is my book, as is my laptop. All of these things, it's possible they exist and possible that they don't, because there was a time they didn't exist, and they could be destroyed. So those are contingent. Well, here's the general idea. Aquinas says, if everything was contingent, there would be a time when nothing existed. But if there was a time when nothing existed, then nothing would exist now, because from nothing comes nothing. Therefore, there must be a necessary being. Now, what in the world is going on there? It's a really tricky argument, and let me tell you why. Unlike the second way, this argument uses a different notion of cause and effect. So Aquinas was of the view that things basically had to be held in existence. That if something wasn't held in existence, it would cease to exist. That is a different notion of cause and effect. So instead of asking what caused me to exist 39 years ago, you would ask, well, what's causing me to exist right now? To our contemporary ears, that doesn't even make sense. The shift started in the 1600s with Leibniz, and now the notion of substance is its natural state is existence, and you have to go out of the way to destroy it. Aquinas and all the people during Aquinas' time didn't believe that, and which means let me give you the thumbnail version. Aquinas' argument works if you grant that notion of cause and effect, that things have to be held in existence now. If you really want to nerd out, Google the difference between causa secundum esse and causa secundum fiere. Probably don't recommend it, but just generally, if you think things had to be held in existence, the argument is perfectly valid. For reasons it's hard to do electronically, if you instead use our normal notion of cause and effect, it's actually invalid. So Aquinas' third way is valid using his notion of cause and effect that nobody uses anymore, invalid using the common notion now. So it tends to just get set aside. We don't fault you for thinking that, Aquinas. You didn't have a time machine, but we don't think that anymore. So what do you need to know about the third way? Valid using his notion of cause and effect, invalid using ours, allows infinite regresses, and of course it's a cosmological argument, so the usual 5 things go. Fourth and fifth way. Here's the general idea. Both of them are considered to be valid unsound. Why? For reasons we don't need to get into. The premises basically have 1,000-year-old science in them. So scientific principles that we just don't think are true anymore. So the fourth way is a kind of weird cosmological argument. The general idea is from gradation, things that admit to degrees. There's gradations of goodness. Things could be better and worse, but, and here's the false scientific premises, the cause of a gradation is either a maximum or an absolute, which is completely false. Therefore, there must be a maximally good being. Very roughly stated, that's the general idea of valid unsound because it has a false science premise. The fifth way, also valid unsound, but it's really interesting because this is one of those really strange arguments. Remember in the last video I told you that design arguments are generally deductive and inductive. The best ones are by analogy. Aquinas tries a deductive design argument in the fifth way. And it's because everybody loved deduction back then. Nobody used induction. And the funny thing is, it fails precisely because it's presented deductively, and so it has to make an all claim instead of a many claim or usually or most claim, and so it makes a false all claim. Roughly speaking, it requires that everything exists for a purpose, and of course we know that's false, at least scientifically false. If you could refrain from childish giggling, an easy example is male nipples. They exist because we know why they exist, because all embryos start off as female, but that doesn't mean, the fact that we can explain it doesn't mean they actually have a purpose. They clearly don't, and so Aquinas' premise that basically requires that everything acts towards some purpose, simply false. but it's not the kind of thing that we can fault him for because, again, 1,000-year-old science. We have no reason to accept 1,000-year-old science, but at the same time, we don't blame Aquinas for using 1,000-year-old science 1,000 years ago. So all you really need to know about the fourth and fifth way, both are considered valid on sound. The fourth way is a cosmological argument, which entails all those five things that all cosmological arguments have in common. And the fifth way, however, it's this odd deductive design argument. So, next time we're going to shift from those kind of antiques to some contemporarily defended cosmological arguments. So make sure you're Googling William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument and then thinking about why it's valid, why it uses only weak PSR, and why the conclusion is incompatible with atheist naturalism. And we'll go from there. See you next time.